The Sunbae He Fell For. Chapter 1. The First Impressions. Jeon Jackson woke up as the alarm in his phone went off. Reaching for his phone, he looked at the time. He sat up a little alerted now and instantly began to regret snoozing the alarm the first 2 times. Oh no, I'm going to be late for the interview. He hurriedly walked towards his bathroom to freshen up. Within 10 minutes, he had somehow managed to brush his teeth, shave, take a bath and wear some decent clothes for his interview. After fixing himself a quick breakfast and having a cup of coffee, he left his house. To avoid getting stuck in the traffic that day, he borrowed a neighbor's motorbike. Within half an hour he had reached the office building, where he was supposed to interview for the position of a junior client acquisition manager. After parking his bike in the parking lot, he checked his watch and realized he had arrived right on time for the interview. A satisfied grin graced his lips. Slowly, he began to walk towards the park which led to the main building. On his way, he saw a young lady sitting in formals on a bench in the park. She had her legs crossed and held a straight posture. He realized she was doing some sort of breathing exercises. Her eyes were shut and she even seemed to be mumbling something. She looks cute, he thought as he walked past her towards the building. As he waited for the lift, he felt someone approach him. Turning around, he found the same young lady from the park coming to stand beside him. She held a bag and a file in her hands. Maybe she works in the same building, he thought. Turns out, the lady was in fact Jackson's team leader, Tammy. He officially met her on the first day of his training. On the same day, when Jackson and the other trainees had been informed about the official guidelines regarding the no-paper policy for the junior employees, he had raised a question about the sanctity of letting the team leaders and other superiors have that liberty. It had raised a few eyebrows, but that was nothing compared to the look of contempt he had received from his new team leader. And later that day, she had asked him to come down to his cabin after he was finished with his training to discuss the matter. When he had walked into her cabin, she had seemed in a joyful mood. Seeing him, however, had seemed to dull the light in her eyes. They had a rocky start, to say the least. Tammy had developed an instant dislike for Jackson due to his habit of giving his opinions on every matter. Jackson, too, had found her to be intolerable at times when she was determined to do things in the same orthodox fashion, refusing to change with the changing times. There was this one time when Tammy had taken their group for an outing at their company resort. On their first night at the resort, someone from their team had mischievously hidden all their cell phones. Another team member, Sam, who had seen Jackson going for a jog late that night, had grown suspicious of him. When all their phones had been found missing, Sam had shared his suspicions with Tammy. It had led to an ugly confrontation between him and Tammy. Thankfully, their team member Gail, who had played the prank, had come forth and accepted the blame. And for the first time that day, Tammy had realized how judgmental she had been towards him. She had looked guilty and had apologized to him in front of her entire team. Jackson had been taken aback to see the sudden change in her. The rest of their outing experience had been fun and uneventful. Still, after his return from the journey, Jackson had walked to their immediate superior's cabin and requested to be placed with a different team leader. Enough had transpired between him and Tammy for them to be working together. Chapter 2. Time flies away. A week later, Jackson's superior had informed him that his request to be placed under another team leader had been rejected, and Jackson had resigned to his fate. But that day he resolved that as soon as his contact with the present company ended, he would look for a job switch. Soon, however, things took a different turn when Tammy specifically asked Jackson to assist her on a new project. Jackson had noticed a change in Tammy's stance towards him after the outing incident. Her decision to have him assist her seemed to be an attempt on her part to try to reconcile and start afresh. And so, the two began to work on the new project. Jackson accompanied her to several client meetings and they ended up spending a lot of time together during these business meetings. On these meetings, he got the opportunity to observe Tammy closely. Jackson soon started to see her in a different light. At these initial preparatory stages and the client meetings, Tammy had unknowingly impressed Jackson with her business and client management skills. He soon realized how disciplined and dedicated she was to her job and how much he could learn from her. Gradually, he began to respect her authority despite their differences. During this time, there was also a monumental change in Tammy's outlook towards him. She had learned to trust Jackson's instincts and sometimes consulted him over several business matters. Jackson had felt a great sense of satisfaction when she had implemented a few of his inputs in the project. They had both learned to accept and adapt. A few weeks after the completion of that project, however, Jackson had been transferred to a different team due to absence of enough manpower in the other team. There, he had worked at the junior level for about 2 years before being promoted as a team leader himself. During this time, Jackson and Tammy hadn't had many interactions except during the regular team meetings and a few outings. On several of these occasions, Jackson and Tammy had reminisced their past and had a good laugh joking about their initial impressions and their Cold Wars. A few months after Jackson's appointment as the team leader, the company took a decision to send 2 of their teams to Summervault for a fast-track training regarding a new project recently acquired by the company. Coincidentally, both Jackson and Tammy's team got randomly selected for the training. So, both Tammy and Jackson ended up in Summervault for their month-long training. The officials at the Summervault branch had assigned rooms in the same hotel on the same floor to the 2 team leaders while the subordinates were arranged to stay at a hotel nearer to the training location. On the first day of training, Jackson got ready and knocked on Tammy's door. He knocked thrice before there was an answer. When she appeared at the door, her eyes seemed all red and puffy. "Are you all right, Miss Kim?" he asked, a little concerned. "I am fine," she spoke firmly. She was still in her pajamas. "Is the bus already here?" she asked a little worried. "Not yet. I had a word with the driver. They are stuck in traffic. It will take them 10 more minutes to reach," he told her. "Thank God. Give me 7 minutes. I'll meet you at the entrance." "Okay." And with that he left her. She had stood by her word and appeared at the entrance on time. Jackson thought she looked a lot normal then dressed in black formals like him, except for her puffy eyes. Later that day during the first half of the training session, Jackson noticed Tammy being distracted. During lunch, the food on her plate had remained almost untouched. A little concerned, Jackson thought of approaching her to inquire after her. Right then, however, he felt his phone vibrating and saw their immediate supervisor's number flashing. Sighing heavily, Jackson went on to answer the call. His supervisor, after inquiring about both the teams and the status of their training, went on to gossip about their CEO. Jackson was informed that their CEO had made announcements regarding his wedding plans that morning and had invited many of his employees, including his supervisor, to attend the ceremony. Jackson tried to sound interested in the matter, but was getting impatient to cut the conversation short and walk towards Tammy. He politely informed his manager that he had to hang up as their lunch break was coming to an end. Before he could hang up, Jackson saw Tammy walking back towards the training room. Later that evening after the end of the day's training sessions, the bus dropped Jackson and Tammy back at their hotel. While the two walked into the hotel lobby, Jackson thought of asking Tammy if she had something troubling her. As Jackson followed her, he found himself struggling with words to approach the conversation. While he was busy contemplating what to do, he noticed a slow change of expressions on Tammy's face. She had stopped in her tracks. He followed her eyes and saw a middle-aged lady with a huge smile on her face approaching them. Before he could make out anything, Tammy had flung herself into the lady's arms and seemed reluctant to let go of her. The lady smiled apologetically at Jackson while patting the girl's back. After a few seconds, Tammy reluctantly stood up straight and gave a huge smile to the lady. Jackson stood there like a clueless kid, mesmerized by the change in Tammy's expressions and her breathtaking smile. She looked so beautiful smiling like that, he thought. Tammy finally introduced Jackson to the lady, who turned out to be her Aunt Mrs. Kim. She spoke to Jackson in a pleasant manner while the three of them took the lift. From their conversation, he learned that Mrs. Kim was in fact one of the board members at their company. That piece of information shocked him as he suddenly realized Tammy's position at their company. Chapter 3. In the mood for some food. On reaching their floor, both Tammy and her aunt bade him farewell before walking towards the other side of the hallway towards Tammy's room. He felt relieved to know that Tammy's had her aunt visit her. To be frank, Tammy's condition that day had really had him worried. He had never seen Tammy so distracted during the 2 years they had known each other. To him, she had always seemed like a strong girl with an iron resolve. After entering his room, Jackson jumped into the bathroom for a hot shower bath. Dressing himself in his black night suit, he turned on the television to catch up the live football match. He hadn't realized how tired he felt until his eyes began to droop during a crucial moment in the match. Finding himself unable to resist the temptation, Jackson turned off the television to take a short nap before going to the hotel's restaurant for dinner. After a few hours, he woke up with an empty stomach. Feeling a bit chilly, he adjusted the temperature of the air conditioner and checked the time on his wristwatch. It was past 12 at night and he realized he had slept for straight 5 hours. Unsure if the restaurant was open this late at night, he decided to take a rain check. Changing into a pair of jeans and a full-sleeved t-shirt, he grabbed his keys and mobile phone, before stepping out of his hotel room into the brightly lit hallway. As he walked towards the lift, his eyes wandered towards Tammy's room. He noticed the door to her room was slightly ajar. Was she still with her aunt? Jackson wondered even as he began to walk in the direction of her room. Instead of peeking through the open door though, he knocked. Sunbae. He hadn't addressed her as Sunbae after becoming a team leader. On his promotion celebration party, after congratulating him for his achievement, she had instructed him that now that they were on the same level, he should treat her as his equal and not his senior. They weren't Sunbae and Hoobae anymore. And yet, now when he had used the word, it sounded so endearing to him instead of the usual Miss Kim he had used to address her. Tammy appeared at the door. She was in her pajamas and smiled when she saw him. Come in, she invited before stepping inside. And so he walked inside. His eyes wandered around her room and he noticed how tidy it looked. The hotel room was spacious just like his, with a sofa placed on one end and a large bed on the other. There was a small refrigerator on the left side beside the sofa. He saw a packet of instant noodles placed on the sofa table and immediately his stomach growled in reaction. Are you hungry? She inquired. Yes, he said a little sheepishly. Actually, as soon as we returned, I fell asleep and couldn't have my dinner. I was about to visit the hotel restaurant, he confessed. There is no use. I just returned from the restaurant. They are closed for the day. All I could get was this, she said, motioning towards the packet of instant noodles. Oh no, he said, a little disappointed. Would you like some ramen? She offered, pointing towards the packet of noodles. He was tempted, but noticing the size of the packet, he realized it could only fill one person's appetite. No, that's okay. You have. He knew he would regret saying that. I have another packet, saying so she opened the refrigerator and took out another packet of noodles along with 2 bottles of an energy drink. She must have realized by his looks how he was craving those noodles. She brought the boiled water from the electric jar and poured it in 2 cups filled with noodles. Seated on the sofa, they began to relish the noodles followed by the sweet energy drink. Has your aunt left already? He asked before putting a forkful of the hot and spicy noodles in his mouth. Yeah, she did. Just about half an hour back. I was so happy to see her. Then it's good that she came. After finishing their supper, Jackson and Tammy ended up having a casual talk about mundane things. Both of them were surprised when they found out they had similar tastes in food and music. Jackson noticed how cheerful she looked when she spoke now. A sharp contrast to how she had appeared this morning. His lips itched to ask what had troubled her that morning, but he refrained from approaching the topic fearing it would trigger her all over again. To distract himself, he turned to look at the window behind them. They were on the 15th floor and from there he saw the city below. It looked like a starry night sky with lights coming out from the vehicle on the street and small establishments around the hotel. He heard Tammy sigh, and turned towards her. Having finished her cup of noodles, she too was looking at the same scene as him. Her eyes seemed to sparkle and her facial features grew soft. Jackson found himself captivated by her at that moment. She looked so beautiful that he couldn't take his eyes off her. And so, when she suddenly turned towards him, Jackson felt embarrassed for he had been caught staring at her. Chapter 4. Sharing a Secret. Do you know our CEO? Her sudden out-of-the-blue question confused him, but he was relieved she hadn't caught him staring at her like a crazy puppy. Yes. Mr. Lee. I've seen him a few times during our group meetings. I heard he is planning to get married. He is my father. Her revelation stunned him a second time that day. Yet again, he seemed to be at a loss of words for a few seconds. But you don't have the same last names. He felt stupid for asking such a silly question even as the words escaped his lips. My parents were separated. My mom was given my custody. I stuck with her surname. Oh. The wheels in his mind began to churn and he suddenly recalled his phone conversation with their supervisor that morning. Suddenly, everything began to fall in place. The news must have been disturbing for you, he said in a matter-of-factly tone. Yes. Papa called me last night to tell me about it. It's not like I am not happy for him. I've met my dad's to-be wife. I know she will make him happy and all, but... She waved her hands in the air trying to come up with a proper explanation for her odd behavior. I lost Mom when I was 19 years old, she finally said as she turned towards the window. Even though Jackson couldn't see her eyes from that angle, he knew there was a pain reflecting in them because he had experienced the same pain several times himself. Hesitantly, she looked back in his direction. And now that Dad is going to have a new family. I felt abandoned. He supplied. Yeah. Kind of. And she sighed, turning her attention towards the streetcars below. He wanted to tell her he understood her. He knew what it felt like. After all, he had gone through a similar experience in his own life, having lost both his parents in an accident all of a sudden. He knew more than enough what she must be going through. But instead of telling her that, he decided to help her come to terms with the situation. And so he asked her, do you love your father, Tammy? Of course, she turned and looked him in the eye. And does he love you the same way? Yes, very much. Both my parents have always loved me dearly. Her eyes took a faraway look when she said, "You know. Despite all the differences between my parents, none of them ever made me feel less loved." "Then you need to trust your father, Tammy. I know right now it seems like he is deserting you, but if he really loves you, he will never let you feel abandoned or less loved. Trust me." And she did. She finally gave him a huge smile. "You know. Aunt told me the exact same thing. That's because she is a wise woman." "Are you complimenting my aunt or yourself?" And he laughed at that. They had passed the heaviest part of the conversation and seemed like having returned to their usual light banter. Jackson looked at the table before him and saw the now empty plastic cups, bottles and wrappers occupying all the space. He rose and began to throw them in the dustbin. Meanwhile, Tammy decided to clean the table with a few wet tissues. When they were done with the cleaning, Jackson thought he should leave for the night. "Thanks for the food. I was literally famished," Jackson said when he reached the door. "Don't thank me. I should be the one thanking you." Tammy spoke a little embarrassed. "Frankly speaking, I was grateful for your company tonight, Jackson." For the first time Jackson felt something move in his heart when she called out his name in that sweet husky voice. "Always happy to help. Good night, Tammy." He blinked his eyes and gave her the most charming, dimpled smile that literally made Tammy's inside melt. She realized she had never paid attention to how handsome he looked when he smiled that way. Tammy's eyes followed him until she saw him turn his keys in and enter his room. Chapter 5. Silent Confessions and Happy Endings. The next day, Jackson and Tammy walked into the training room with cheerful smiles on their faces. As the sessions progressed, the two enthusiastic team leaders engrossed themselves in all the activities and games, playing rivals and making their best efforts to have their own team win against the other. This became their daily routine. When they were at the office they behaved like complete professionals and rivals. However, during their dinners every night at the hotel, they spent time together, enjoying each other's company. As the days progressed, Jackson and Tammy's feelings towards each other progressed from friendship to attraction and affection. Both had realized that they were falling for the other, but the two parties seemed to lack the courage to admit it. Tired of the circumstances and unsurety, Tammy decided to take the matters in her hands and confess her feelings for Jackson. Girls could do that too, she told herself. That day as she walked out of the training room, Tammy made a firm resolve to make a confession to Jackson the next day, which was apparently their last day of training. She thought it best to do it after the end of their farewell party tomorrow. That evening, while returning from the office in the bus, Jackson noticed Tammy smiling happily while she spoke to someone on the phone. He ended up feeling jealous of the person on the other side of the phone. He sighed as he realized how he wanted to be the one to make her smile that way. "Then you should tell her how you feel about her, you idiot." His mind seemed to reprimand him. Soon, their bus dropped them back at the hotel and both Jackson and Tammy walked through the lobby towards the lift. He stole a glance at Tammy and noticed how she still had a huge smile plastered on her lips. Unable to hold on to his curiosity anymore, Jackson asked Tammy the reason for her happiness. It was then that she informed him about her conversation with her dad earlier on the phone. She told him that her father and his to-be wife had insisted on having her make arrangements for their wedding. Tammy confided in Jackson that she knew they had done it with the intention of making her feel like an essential part of their new family. As they reached at the end of the lobby, Jackson noticed a bellboy rushing in their direction with a heavily loaded luggage cart. Tammy, who seemed busy telling him about her plans for her father's wedding, walked without noticing the approaching cart. Suddenly, she found herself being snatched by Jackson, wrapped in his sturdy arms, as he pulled her towards his side. Tammy felt an electric shock pass through her body as she watched and heard the screeching sound of the cart being rushed past her while she lay limply in Jackson's arms. Jackson held on to her with his eyes fixed on the cart and the bellboy. He glared at the bellboy, who had failed to notice Tammy while rushing his cart towards her. The bellboy mouthed a silent apology to Jackson as he turned to look back at Tammy safe in Jackson's arms. "Thanks," Tammy said to Jackson. "Always happy to help." That seemed like his favorite line, she thought. Jackson smiled at her, but he didn't release her from his grip. Unconsciously, she held her lower lip between her teeth as she began feeling a bit awkward at the thought of standing in a man's arms in a half-embracing position in the middle of a lobby filled with people staring at her. Jackson felt his attention diverted by her worrying lips. He felt a great urgency to kiss her worrying lips, but as he looked at her eyes surveying her surroundings, he controlled his urges. Tammy looked surprised when she realized that they were actually standing in a dim corner of the lobby near the lift. The next moment she felt herself being released from Jackson's grip. Instead, he laced his fingers through hers and began to walk towards the lift. This time, Tammy felt elated and a little giddy. They kept holding hands as they walked through the hallway towards her room. He gently kissed her on the forehead before walking away to his own room. None of them spoke about their feelings, yet they had found what was in the other's heart. Later that night, instead of taking Tammy to the hotel restaurant for dinner, Jackson had taken her to a quiet open sky cafe restaurant near a lake that was a 10 minutes drive away from their hotel. She had been surprised to find that they were the only customers present at the cafe. The sight of cafe restaurant decorated with beautiful paper lanterns and flowers and the view of the lake made it all look like a picture right out of an old romance novel. There, they enjoyed a hearty meal while appreciating the view of the lake at night. While walking back to their hotel, Jackson had failed to confess his love for her. And he knew he would regret his decision the moment he saw her being pulled into a bear hug by a tall and handsome guy standing in the hotel lobby. "OMG. Jiho, I am so glad to see you." Her excitement left Jackson in a sullen mood and he wanted to walk away from them or better pull apart the man hugging Tammy. He heard with disinterest as Tammy's apparent friend Jiho spoke to her about old times. Jackson found out through their conversation that Jiho and Tammy had lived in the same neighborhood and that he had had a crush on Tammy. The last piece of information disturbed Jackson as he saw a potential rival in Jiho. During the course of conversation and introductions, the three of them had made their way through the elevator and were now standing outside Tammy's hotel room. A jealous Jackson refused to leave Jiho alone with Tammy, and so despite of feeling like an intruder and left out as the two long-lost friends chatted, he hung around acting unfazed. After what seemed like ages, Jiho decided to bid farewell to Tammy. He informed them that he was here on business and had been staying at the hotel since 2 days. When Jiho regretfully informed Tammy about his plan to depart the next day to Japan for a week-long trip before returning back to Summervault, Jackson felt so relieved that he literally exhaled louder than he should have, drawing both Tammy and Jiho's attention. An embarrassed Jackson shook hands with Jiho as the latter gave him a devilish "I know your secret" smile before turning to hug Tammy. Jackson was now sure that Jiho was deliberately trying to get him riled up, but he resisted the urge to punch the fellow after seeing Tammy's happy face. As the elevator doors closed and Jiho disappeared from their sight, Jackson decided to take his leave. He was extremely disappointed with himself for being unable to confess his feeling for Tammy, and the arrival of Jiho had caused his confidence to dwindle even further. "Okay then. Have a pleasant night, Tammy. I'll get going now." But as soon as he turned to walk away from Tammy, she held his hand and he turned back. And then, she was kissing him, with her hands resting on the collar of his shirt. After getting over the initial shock, Jackson's arms went around her small back as he pulled her closer and deepened the kiss, closing his eyes and pulling her even closer if that was possible. When they seemed out of breath after what seemed like ages, he looked in her eyes and finally said, "I'm truly madly deeply irrevocably in love with you, Sunbae." "I know." And she laughed, seeing his dumbfounded expression before saying, "I love you too." And this time when he bade her good night, both of them left with a content smile on their lips and a giddy feeling in their hearts. End of the story. Thank you for listening. If you like the story, please subscribe for more content and stories.